it again and find I'm not the man they think I am. Oh, no. I'm a rocket man. Burning out his fuse out here alone.
Welcome back, students. It's time for the final installment of How Do You Fight a Cold War? In this lesson, we are going to be looking at the Cold War method, quote unquote, known as showing off. Showing off. What does this mean? What do we mean by showing off? And how is this a method for fighting a Cold War? Well, over the course of the Cold War, the two superpowers engaged in a number of high-profile events designed to gain worldwide media attention and attempt to one-up the other side by showing off, basically announcing to the world that we are the best. And this included major milestones in the space race, but also other notable events, including public speeches. The first event in our exploration of showing off is right at the very beginning of the Cold War. You might recall Winston Churchill gave a famous speech to an American audience. He was invited to speak by Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, and it is at this address that he gives his very famous Iron Curtain speech, in which he describes the spread of communism throughout Eastern Europe as if an iron curtain has descended upon the continent of Europe, separating the communist and the non-communist countries. Churchill was a staunch anti-communist, and he used a lot of very powerful rhetoric. Churchill was a masterful speaker, and it went over very well in the United States and the West in general, but it did not go over so well in the Soviet Union. Stalin saw it as a very threatening speech. He used a lot of militaristic language, and Stalin claimed that because of this speech, it was showing that the Western powers desired war, and clearly it made an impact. We're going to fast forward about 11 years and kick off the space race. So in 1957, the Soviet Union shocked the world by launching the very first man-made satellite into space, and they called it Sputnik.
Today, a new moon is in the sky, a 23-inch metal sphere placed in orbit by a Russian rocket. Here, an artist's conception of how the feat was accomplished. A three-stage rocket. Number one, the booster in the class of an intercontinental missile. Its weight estimated at 50 tons. The smaller second stage took over at 5,000 miles an hour and carried on to the highest point reached. 500 miles up, the artificial moon is boosted to a speed counterbalancing the pull of gravity and released. You are hearing the actual signals transmitted by the Earth-circling satellite. One of the great scientific feats of the age.
American officials are shocked at how quickly the Soviets have made progress in space technology, because they really, up to this point, had looked down on communism. They saw communism as this sort of backward system that was not really going to accomplish that much that quickly, and we were blown away. We suddenly realized how behind we were in science education and how advanced the Soviet Union was, and it caused American policymakers and government to really start taking a closer look at how science was taught in American classrooms. And our own space program got jump-started as a result of this. We realized that we were now behind the Soviet Union in the sort of technology that could put objects into space. Now, you may be wondering, well, what's the big deal? I mean, Sputnik really didn't do much. It just sort of orbited around the world and beeped regularly. It's not really about Sputnik. What it's about is the ability to use rockets to put man-made things into space. And if the Soviet Union can place something as harmless as Sputnik in space successfully, then they could also potentially put nuclear weapons into space. Up to this point, really the only way to deliver a nuclear weapon was by loading it on a plane, flying it where you need it to go, and dropping it. That's how we did it in Japan. This introduces an entirely new weapons delivery system. And for that reason, the space race really is linked to the arms race. That is why it matters. Let's take a break from the space race. In 1959, Moscow hosts what's known as the American National Exhibition. And at this event, the United States and many of its leading industries bring over some of their state-of-the-art, top-of-the-line products. Most of these products tend to be focused on modern conveniences like washing machines and dishwashers and stoves and refrigerators and the kind of thing that really makes life easier and more enjoyable. Representing the United States at that time, Vice President Richard Nixon visits Moscow, and he goes on a tour of this exhibition with Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. Stalin actually dies near the end of the 1950s, and Khrushchev takes over, and they're touring these displays, and they're engaging in what came to be known as the kitchen debates. And during these kitchen debates, Nixon and Khrushchev are debating which country has the better system in terms of economics and industry. Nixon argues that America is clearly superior because we are able to produce so many things that people want. And then Khrushchev comes back and talks about how the Soviet Union has a great system of heavy industry and how they're able to build all kinds of weapons and stuff. And these kitchen debates were televised, put on radio, and they were seen and heard all around the world. And it was two powers really debating over which had the better system. Very public, definitely an example of showing off.
Vice President Nixon escorts Soviet Premier Khrushchev on a preview of the United States Fair at Skolniki Park in Moscow. It's the official opening of the American Exposition, counterpart of the Soviet Trade Show in New York, and dedicated to showcasing the high standard of life in our country. But on this occasion, traditional diplomacy goes by the board, and the story of the fair itself is eclipsed by a crackling exchange between Nixon and Khrushchev, begun off-camera and finished off before the American Ampex color videotape recorders. Every aspect of the Cold War and Soviet-American rivalry is argued in blunt and forthright terms. The threat of atomic warfare, diplomacy by ultimatum, economic progress. Says Mr. Key, the Soviet will overtake America and then wave bye-bye. Both Khrushchev and Nixon appear to enjoy themselves. Says Khrushchev, he is a communist spokesman dealing with a capitalist lawyer.
All that I can say from the way you talk and the way you dominate the conversation, you would have made a good lawyer yourself.
But the culmination is agreement that both nations should hear the startling debate uncensored.
We have all of these reporters here. We have every word that you have said. Every word that you have said has been taken down, and I would promise you that every word that you have said here will be reported in the United States, and they will see you say it on television.
Но я видел, я сомневаюсь, поэтому я хочу, чтобы вы, вице-президент, что вы даете слово, что моя речь тоже будет записана на английском языке.
Telecast over TV.
Будет, нет?
Certainly it will. Certainly. Yeah. Right, right. And at the same token, everything that I say will be recorded and translated and will be carried all over the Soviet Union. That's a fair bargain.
In 1960, those good feelings faded, and the leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, gave a very infamous speech at the United Nations. He interrupts a debate when his country is criticized. And as a show of his disapproval, he takes his shoe off and he bangs it on the podium. And the words he says gets translated into English as, "We will bury you." Now, at the time, some in the West took this as a threat of nuclear war. Others thought he was simply talking about how communism would eventually metaphorically triumph over capitalism. But needless to say, when you stand up at the United Nations and bang your shoe on a podium and tell the other side, "We will bury you," that's kind of scary. That definitely made worldwide news coverage. In 1961, yet again, the Soviets have another first. We're beyond satellites. Now we have the first human being in space. Yuri Gagarin is the first man to be put into space. He was a cosmonaut. There were secret rumors that Yuri was actually the first human to survive a space mission, and that the Soviets had attempted previous trial runs and that the cosmonauts did not survive. So whether or not that's true, the fact remains that the first one that we know about was Yuri Gagarin, yet again showing the United States how far we were behind the Soviet Union in outer space technology, once again heating up the space race. And you can see in the background here, this missile that Gagarin traveled in, well, if it can carry a man, again, it could also carry weapons. Well, finally, in 1961, America jumps into the space race and begins to catch up. The first American in space is Alan Shepard. And a little bit after him, John Glenn becomes the first American to orbit the Earth, to actually go all the way around the Earth in space. So Americans are finally beginning to catch up in the space race. Again, major news events here showing off the fact that the United States is developing its science and technology. If the Soviet Union started the space race and scared the United States definitely finished the space race. We put the exclamation point at the end of the space race by landing on the moon in 1969. The Soviet Union had sent unmanned missions to the moon, but we were the first ones to touch down and put a human foot on the lunar surface. That was Neil Armstrong, and he gave his very famous first words.
The surface appears to be very, very fine-grained as you get close to it. It's almost like a powder. Ground mass is very fine. I'm going to step off the limb. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Oh, that looks beautiful.
Finally, the United States had pulled ahead of the Soviet Union in the space race. Let's fast forward a little bit more. 1980 rolls around. Now, you might remember from the proxy wars lesson that in 1979, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. Well, at the time, the U.S. president was Jimmy Carter. Carter was not especially militaristic. He actually was very much in favor of using America's influence to improve human rights around the world. He was not really one to start a war, but he did want to do something symbolic to show the Soviet Union that their invasion of Afghanistan was not something to be proud of. And so the United States led an effort by many other Western nations to boycott the 1980 Summer Olympics. And we did. There were no American or British or many other Western countries represented at the 1980 Olympics, which were held in Moscow. And as a result, it ends up being one of the most poorly attended Olympic Games in modern history. It really is only communist countries competing. Well, in 1984, the Soviet Union gets a little chance at payback with this. The 1980 Olympics were held in Moscow in the Soviet Union. The 1984 Olympics were held in Los Angeles in the United States. And the Soviet Union decided to get a little payback, and they and their quote-unquote allies refused to join the games held in the United States. A little bit of turnabout is fair play, I suppose. Again, does this really do much? Probably not. It's all very symbolic. It's all about, again, getting in the headlines. It's in the news. It's flexing muscles. It's showing off. It's one-upping the other side. There's one more key event I want to look at when it comes to showing off. But to understand this event, you have to understand what the background was to it. The event revolves around the Berlin Wall. So take a second and look at this little snippet from the Cold War Oversimplified, and then we'll take a look at an American president's response to it.
This was a full-on economic battle raging between capitalism and communism in Europe. If the Western nations developed faster and better than the East, that would be a defeat for Stalin. So he set up his own rival economic recovery plan, which he called Comecon, and he also set up Cominform, which gave him more political control over the Eastern Bloc. But nowhere did this economic battle rage harder than in the city of Berlin. Caught over 100 miles behind Soviet lines, the city had been divided up between the Allies, and the western segments were still under Western control. East Berliners could travel freely to West Berlin, see the economic prosperity and think, maybe this communism thing ain't so great after all. I'm gonna have fun tonight. You're home late. Oh, Stalin. I was just out with my friends. Friends? You stink of capitalism. You're out engaging in imperialist debauchery again. I swear, Ivan, I can't keep doing this. The Soviet Union was advancing its technology, but it was also bleeding its coffers dry, and all of the money was going towards the military, not the people. Life under communism was still as hard as ever, and Berlin remained a thorn in the Soviet side. The contrast between the economically prosperous West and the struggling East was clearer day by day, and East Berliners were still able to freely travel to the West. Now, many of them were deciding to stay there. Millions defected to West Germany via West Berlin, causing Eastern factories to lose workers and taking a heavy toll on the economy. Soviet leaders decided this couldn't continue any longer. First, Khrushchev tried this: leave West Berlin, or else. Or else what? Or else I'll be really mad at you. Yeah, no, we're gonna stay. Listen, man, West Berlin is ours, East Berlin is yours. That's just how it is. Kennedy felt pretty good about his show of American resolve. But wait a second, did you catch that? Let's replay it.
East Berlin is yours.
Uh-oh, Kennedy just told Khrushchev that the USA wouldn't interfere in what the Soviets did with their section of Berlin, so Khrushchev came up with a new idea. We're gonna build a wall, and it's gonna be a big, beautiful wall, and it's gonna keep out all the Mexicans. No, sir, that's wrong. It's gonna keep in these Berliners. Oh, sorry, it's gonna keep in all the Mexicans. On August 13th, 1961, Berliners woke up to find their city divided into two, with barbed wire and guards blocking the border between East and West. Over time, a wall was constructed throughout the city. Families were torn apart. Thousands would risk their lives escaping over the wall, and hundreds would die trying. To the despair of Berliners, the West were unable to do anything about it. But the wall did put on full display the failure of the communist system. As Kennedy said, democracy is not perfect, but we have never had to put a wall up to keep our people in.
In 1987, President Ronald Reagan visits the site of the Berlin Wall. By this point, the Soviet leader is Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev, as we will see in later lessons, starts signaling that he's willing to make some changes, perhaps even try to reform communism. Reagan wants to see just how far Gorbachev is willing to go. And so he shows up to Berlin and he gives a very famous speech in which he tells Gorbachev to, quote, tear down this wall. Reagan's words are met with thunderous applause. He gives this speech in 1987. Later on in November of 1989, increasing pressures are being put on the Soviet Union. Gorbachev has begun to relax the grip of the Red Army, and sure enough, Germans start tearing the wall down, and the soldiers don't stop them. So the wall, just a couple years after the speech, does actually end up coming down, and that will signal the beginning of the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Soviet Union. So now that we've seen some key events, answer the questions down below. And again, I want you to continue thinking about how effective were these different methods for fighting a Cold War.